Story of Clever Elsa, which is a funny story because there are funny stories in the Brothers Grimm collection. Clever Elsa was still living with her parents, who were very keen to see her married, and a suitor was coming to court her, and his name was Hans. And Hans said, "But is your daughter Elsa clever? I really need a smart, clever wife." And the parents said, "Of course, Elsa is the cleverest person we know." So that evening, Elsa went down to the cellar, carrying a jug to go and get some beer from the barrel in the cellar. And she went down the wooden stairs with a jug in one hand, and she looked at the barrel of beer, turned the tap, and began to fill the jug. And as she looked around her, she noticed, and she'd never seen this before, a pickaxe that had been left by the masons, dangling from the beam above the beer barrel. And she thought, if I marry Hans and we have a son, one day he will come down the stairs with the jug in his hand, just as I am now, and he will stand where I'm standing now, and the pickaxe will fall on him and cut his skull in two. And at the thought of the tragic death of her as yet unborn son, Elsa sat down on a little stool and began to weep. And because Elsa didn't appear back upstairs with the jug of beer, her mother sent the maid down. And the maid found Elsa sitting on the little stool, weeping. And Elsa said to the maid, if I marry Hans and we have a son, one day he will come down here to draw some beer, and the pickaxe there in the beam will fall down and will split his skull in two, and he will die, and I will be so sad." And the maid sat down beside Elsa and began to cry. But the party upstairs were getting a little thirsty, so the mother sent a servant down, and the servant heard the story. Before long there were 3 weeping women in the cellar, and very thirsty people upstairs. So the mother came down the steps and saw Elsa and the maid and the servant girl all crying about the pickaxe that was hanging from the beam above the beer barrel, and how one day it would fall down and it would split the skull of Elsa and Hans' son, and they would all be so sad. And the mother began to cry. And Hans, who by this time was getting very thirsty, thought, perhaps they're waiting downstairs in the cellar for me. So he went down the stairs, and there he saw Elsa, the maid, the servant, and the mother all crying because it would be so sad if Elsa and Hans' son were to be killed by the pickaxe that was hanging from the beam above the beer barrel. And Hans listened to the story and said, I don't need a wife who is any cleverer than this. I think Elsa will be the ideal wife for me. So they got married. And they hadn't been married for very long, when one day Hans said, I am going off to work to earn some money. So while I'm gone, go out to the wheat field, cut some wheat so that we can take it to the miller and have some flour, then you can bake some bread. So Elsa nodded and said, yes, of course. So Hans went off to do some work and earn some money. And Elsa took her scythe, went off to the wheat field and looked around her and thought, what shall I do first? Shall I cut the wheat first, or shall I have a little sleep first? I know, I'll have a little sleep, and then I'll cut the wheat. So she lay down in the wheat field on a warm day and fell asleep. And the day passed, and the sun began to set, and Hans went home and said, "Oh, look at this. My wife is so industrious, she doesn't even come home to eat." So he sat down on his chair and carried on working. Presumably he could work from home because there was a flu pandemic. So after some time, Elsa woke up and thought, well, this is very strange. I'm laying in a wheat field. But by this time, she was laying under a net because Hans, who had been a little confused when his wife didn't come home, had gone out to the wheat field and found her laying there, sound asleep. And he had taken a net with little bells sewn onto it that was used for catching birds. And he'd used it to throw over his sleeping wife. So poor Elsa, when she stood up, with every movement, the bells jingled, and the more she struggled to get out of the net, the less she seemed able to. So she walked home to her house, thinking, am I Elsa? I don't know who I am. And when Hans heard the jingling of the little bells on the bird net, he looked out of the window. And Elsa looked in through the window and said, is Elsa in there? And Hans said, yes. And so Elsa thought, well, I can't be Elsa then. I must be someone else, and I don't know who I am. So Elsa walked through the village. But every one of her neighbours, when they heard the bells ringing, thought, that's strange. And they wouldn't open the door to Elsa. So poor Elsa, who was still wrapped in the net with the jingling bells, thought, I must find who I really am. So she walked out of the village and was never seen again. But as she was in search of her true self, I imagine she ended up in California because that does seem to be where most people find their true selves. I think I like those stories. Actually, the story about the character that's usually referred to as the simpleton is very, very different from the fool. The fool, of course, in the sort of Will Kemp type tradition, is actually a very skilled job, but the fool in storytelling is the kind of ordinary person who goes out and has adventures and always wins through. The simpleton, like clever Hans and clever Elsa, and coming up soon we have lucky Hans, and of course Shakespeare's Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing. They are great fun. I don't know what the wonderful world of storytelling would be like without them. So this humble fool and this humble teller wishes you all a wonderful day. May you find your true self, and I will see you again soon. Take care.